Previously, on Years of Living Dangerously.
Thank you.
Bangladesh is the size of Iowa. So think about all of the U.S. being packed into Iowa.
So you've seen this city expand?
Yes. Every day people coming from the rural areas.
This would be considered a good living space in the city. And climate change is exacerbating all of this.
They're forced to come here.
Oh yes. Water is creeping into people's homes.
17% of the landmass, 13% of the population will be inundated.
How much of this is affected?
Below that, all will be underwater for 1 meter sea level rise.
Chad Tilley, a former U.S. Air Force pilot, has been flying relief missions in Bangladesh for the last 8 years.
Have you flown a bunch of small airplanes before?
Yeah, a few.
Okay. Have you been in a seaplane before?
No.
Okay, cool. First time. Copy, clear for takeoff.
I've spent the last few days in Dhaka, Bangladesh's overcrowded capital, where thousands of new migrants are arriving every day. Now Chad is taking me south, to the part of the country where most of these migrants come from. I want to see what's making them come to Dhaka.
So Michael, you look at Dhaka, it's kind of like Legoland. If you look, you'll see just buildings everywhere. That area off the left wing is the most densely populated square kilometer on the face of the earth. 144,000 people per square kilometer.
It's crazy how quiet this city seems from the air. And before long, we've left it behind completely.
Unlike in America where we have a lot of rock and gravel in our soil, here we have muddy kind of soft sand. The water can do with it as it please. You see how all these fields are reflecting back, not just the river, all still water. You see how all this area is still underwater.
I've heard people call Bangladesh a land of rivers, but that didn't prepare me for what I'm seeing. There's water everywhere.
In your experience, is it raining more lately or more intensely?
I've been here for 8 years, and I fly down here weekly, daily.
Yeah.
And this is some of the highest water level that I've seen in my time.
Right.
I believe that I'm flying in the midst of climate change.
Right.
Reporting on climate change has taken me all over the world. But sooner or later, the story always leads me back home. The United States has put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than any other country in history. So what is our responsibility to the rest of the planet? If there's one person who should have an answer to that question, it's the president. Barack Obama's record on climate change is mixed. He's made some important steps forward, like placing new restrictions on coal-fired power plants, and he's sharply increased fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks. But the issue certainly hasn't taken center stage in his presidency. He's also been limited in what he can do because of opposition from Republicans and coal and oil state Democrats. Given how serious the threat is, it's hard to argue that America is doing enough. I wonder what the president himself thinks.
All right.
Welcome to Chile, man.
Thank you. I'm a senior scientist for Conservation International. My expertise is biology, so climate change has never been part of my own research. But today I'm joining an expedition with glaciologist Dr. Paul Majewski, and I'm about to see what cutting-edge climate science looks like up close.
Sanjayan, how are you? Welcome to the Chilean Andes.
Good to see you.
Great to see you.
Where are we going?
We're going to be going right up there.
Can I see it from here?
No, you can't. It's right around the corner. It's about just under 20,000 feet.
Right around the corner is not quite. That's like We're going to a glacier at the top of a volcano called Tupungatito. Paul says it's one of the only places in the world we can find what he's looking for. A pristine record of Earth's climate frozen in ice.
The ice has been very, very cold, and the record in the glacier is really well preserved.
But you might have to drag me up there a little bit.
I'll bet you'll do just fine.
All right.
I'm not so sure. The climb will take 5 days, ending up at an elevation over 19,000 feet. Paul tells me very few people have ever set foot up there, and even our Chilean guides say it's a punishing trip. But what's even scarier is what Paul thinks he might find. Evidence that our climate could be changing much more dramatically than we even realize.
Are changing the atmosphere in unexpected and in unprecedented ways.
That the greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
The atmosphere and ocean have warmed. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished. Sea level has risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have...
There's no more fire season. We have wildfires all year round.
Climate change, extreme weather, call it what you will, and our vulnerability to
it. The 12 years of drought has left the landscape bone dry.
We got any patriots in the crowd?
A new scientific report has determined the last decade was the warmest on record.
Our world is changing faster and more dramatically than ever before.
Okay, guys, we're gonna come and land in the water now. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened. There it is.
Yeah, that's no dinghy.
I'm finally here, in southern Bangladesh. There's so much water in this part of the country that boats are the main way to get around. And for the next few days, I'll be living on one. The ML Balawi. I asked Dr. Atik Rahman, the climate scientist I met earlier in my trip, to join me down here. You're an expert. I am admittedly a novice, and I've come here and learned...
Well, we are trying to learn.
No, and I've learned a bit, but the more I learn, the more I realize how much there is to learn and how complicated the problem is. I was wondering if you could share with me some of your thoughts about climate migration.
All the predictions are that there is going to be huge migration around climate change in the decades to come. Now, when we ask the local communities, now that you had one cyclone, two cyclones, three, and fourth one, you know, what is your feeling? They don't want to go.
It's like taking someone from their mother.
Yeah, exactly.
But while these people may not want to leave, soon they may not have a choice. Cyclones are getting more intense. Two recent ones, Sidr and Ayla, left more than 1 million people homeless. And other more subtle changes in the climate can also wreak havoc here.
We talk about the sea level rise going up by 1 meter in 2100. Now, that's not what ordinary people are worried about, 2100. They are worried about their next meal. And that is being affected by climate change impacts. For example, these people have learned a very fine-tuned agricultural system. But if the rain comes 10 days earlier or 10 days later, they won't know where to sow their seedlings, which is the basis of the next plants. And If it comes too heavy, then it's a flood. And if it's a flood, then the seedlings die. So they don't have the seedling for the next crop.
And there's another threat to the crops that we can't even see. Salt.
What happens is when the cyclone hits, salt water is pushed further north into the areas which were otherwise very arable and giving good crops.
In 2009, Cyclone Isla pushed salt water so far inland that 5 years later, much of it is still there. And the rising sea level only makes this worse.
So a cyclone not only destroys the trees and the infrastructure, but also the agricultural crops. Once they're covered by a layer of salt, the productivity isn't there. Many of the efforts we are doing to eliminate our poverty will be severely hindered by the impacts of climate change.
Atik tells me that after a long history of famine, one of his country's greatest achievements is that it now grows enough food to be nearly 100% self-sufficient. But climate change raises the question, for how long? Walking through this mud, I am beginning to understand how fragile life is becoming here.
Michael? Hi, hello. Hi. There were 2 villages from 2009 Isla that has really swallowed these 2 villages, devoured it, as they say.
Seeing these remnants of people's homes makes it hard to grasp why they try to stay. Especially because all of this will eventually be underwater.
If they're forced to go, then go to the nearest embankment for a temporary shelter. The next stage is the urban centers like Khulna, the local city they would go to. And the last stage is the slums of Dhaka, which are overcrowded. So it's not very easy to say, hey, let's go. You know, it's not a picnic, it's life. Projection shows that by 2050, 2070, between 20 and 30 million Bangladeshis are going to be displaced. They'll have to be accommodated somewhere.
Our founders believed that those of us in positions of power are elected not just to serve as custodians of the present, but as caretakers of the future. Someday our children and our children's children will look at us in the eye and they'll ask us, did we do all that we could when we had the chance to deal with this problem and leave them a cleaner, safer, more stable world? And I want to be able to say, yes, we did.
In your June 26 Georgetown speech on climate, you concluded by saying, someday our children and our children's children will look at us in the eye and they'll ask us, did we do all that we could? And I want to be able to say, yes, we did. How are you doing with your girls?
You know, every day I think about what I'm leaving behind for them. The truth is, we're not yet doing all that we need to do. Now, the good news is that America actually has made significant progress over the last 5 years. You've seen the price of solar power and wind power drop significantly. The rules that we put forward in terms of fuel efficiency on cars are going to take huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, as well as saving American taxpayers about $1.7 trillion in what they otherwise would have spent on gas.
If you take the UN's climate study, it basically says that if we go beyond 2 degrees centigrade in global average temperature since the Industrial Revolution, we're going to cross into some really dangerous, unstable territory, Arctic melting, massive sea level rise, disruptive storms. The International Energy Agency says in order to stay under that 2-degree rise, we really have to keep most of the oil, gas, and coal, 70% is a rough number they use, in the ground. Do you agree with that?
Well, science is science, and there is no doubt that if we burned all the fossil fuel that's in the ground right now, that the planet's going to get too hot, and the consequences could be dire.
So we can't burn it all?
We're not going to be able to burn it all. What that means is, over the course of the next couple of decades, we're going to have to basically build a ramp from how we currently use energy to where we need to use energy. We're not going to turn off a switch and suddenly we're no longer using fossil fuels. But we have to use this time wisely. I very much believe in keeping that 2 Celsius target as a goal.
You have many supporters in the environmental community, and for good reason. But one of the complaints we hear is that the president's done wonderful things on coal, but then in his State of the Union or other speeches, he'll tout how much we're exploring offshore oil, natural gas, coal. How do you wrestle with that?
Well, here's how I think about it. We've got to meet folks where they are. I don't always lead with the climate change issue because if you right now are worried about whether you got a job or you can pay the bills, the first thing you want to hear is how do I meet the immediate problem? One of the hardest things in politics is getting a democracy to deal with something now where the payoff is long-term or the price of inaction is decades away.
We just set out on our 5-day ascent of Tupungatito. Until we get to the top, this trip is less about science than endurance. Which is why we are also joined by a team of Chilean cowboys who will guide us on this treacherous journey. I'm definitely out of my element here, and it's a relief when we finally stop for a break. It also gives me some time to ask Paul why he wants to go on this crazy trip.
Very special place.
Spectacular, you know? If it wasn't the fact that I was not able to breathe, it would be fantastic.
That's right.
Over the past few decades, Paul has been collecting ice core samples from around the world to create a record of Earth's climate going back thousands of years. And he's turned up evidence of something frightening, that climate can change far more quickly than we ever imagined.
Everybody believed, including me, that the climate system operated slowly. All of a sudden, we saw these tremendous changes, many degrees Fahrenheit happening in less than 10 years, in some cases in less than 1 year, and staying at that level for hundreds of years. So abrupt climate change was born, and we realized the system can change quickly.
What are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about disaster moving quickly?
For some parts of the planet, yeah.
Really? Doesn't that terrify you?
Oh, yeah.
Paul says in the past, abrupt climate change events may have brought down entire civilizations. Until around 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia spanned what is now Syria, Iraq, and southern Turkey. But then, an abrupt shift in rainfall patterns caused a severe drought, and the empire collapsed. 3,000 years later, the same thing happened in Central America. Stricken by drought, the Mayan civilization virtually disappeared around 900 AD. And 650 years ago in Greenland, an abrupt change in temperatures put a swift end to the Viking colonies that had prospered there for centuries. These sudden events, says Paul, were triggered by natural cycles, slow changes to the climate over thousands of years that eventually reached a tipping point. Now he's worried that greenhouse gas emissions could be pushing our planet towards another tipping point, but in a fraction of the time it would take naturally. To find out if that's happening, Paul needs ice samples from the top of that mountain. That's easier said than done.
It's incredibly rough terrain. You know, when you're on the horses, you just hang on them in the saddles, and then you just pray. There's no sense of controlling these horses. You just hold on, don't look down, and then trust that they'll get up there.
Ironically, man-made climate change is actually making the trek itself more difficult. A couple of decades ago, they could climb to just 16,000 feet and find ice that had been frozen for millennia. Now that's all melted, so we have to go almost 4,000 feet higher. And soon there's a reminder of just how dangerous this climb is. One of the cowboys has a bad fall and breaks his collarbone. But the most treacherous terrain is still ahead.
As As I make my way through southern Bangladesh, what I'm seeing is hard to take in. Half-submerged trees, houses built on stilts to keep them above the rising water. There's something apocalyptic and otherworldly about it all. I come across a family whose home, perched on the edge of a riverbank, literally washed away in the night. Now, they are searching for another place to live. And a few days into my trip, I see one of the most surreal things I've ever seen. A floating hospital.
Hi, Michael.
Runa Khan is the co-founder of Friendship, an organization that provides health services to the most inaccessible places.
Living here is the challenge. You know that disaster is going to strike you. So they work towards the months in which they know that it happens. You know, they know when the floods come in, they know when the seasons of the storms. So they're prepared. What happens when it comes without that preparation and it keeps coming and knocking you out every time you want to stand on your feet? And that's what's happening.
What diseases and health issues have you seen increase?
Skin infection due to the salinity and being in the water all the time, diarrheal disease, ARI, respiratory tract infection, gynecological problems, like even childbirth becomes so difficult. Mortality rates of the mother and the child increases. Due to the climate change, not only is there a health issue, there is a livelihood issue.
As I tour the boat, I'm struck by all the unforeseen impacts climate change can have. But I'm also amazed by how resilient these people are, how hard they're trying to hang on to their lives here. It makes me wonder, how much can people adapt? In order to stay here, people will need a way to grow food even as salt water creeps further and further inland. It's one of the biggest challenges they face. And I heard about an American effort to help.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Welcome.
Look at this palace afloat.
Yeah.
American Ambassador Dan Mosina has served in the U.S. Foreign Service for over 30 years in countries from India to Angola. He says he requested this post in Bangladesh because he fell in love with the country during a previous assignment here.
We're off to visit a rice paddy, and we're going to see some comparisons of different rice seeds. We'll see a traditional variety, and we'll see an improved flood-tolerant variety.
Dan tells me rice makes up 80% of the diet here, and Bangladeshis take pride in their rice.
There are over 500 varieties of rice in Bangladesh. You know, we Americans, we think of white rice and brown rice, but they have 500. What's really special about the flood-tolerant variety is it has the same flavor of rice as the traditional variety. Otherwise, people won't eat it. They won't grow it. They have to have the taste. I must say, I've become a rice snob, too. You can really see it here. You see it? This is the improved variety that is stress tolerant. Yep. And this variety will endure, and listen to this, being completely submerged for up to 15 days, whereas the other one, you know, after 3 or 4 days, it's going to take a real wallop.
This kind of work is obviously making this land more usable, but all estimates suggest that within several decades, this part of Bangladesh will be underwater.
It's sobering, but as I look ahead, I think people can adapt.
Yes, but I do wonder if adaptation has its limits, and we may one day come to a place where we discover that it does, but for the time
I think
being,
you're right.
I can tell the ambassador is a naturally optimistic person, but he also appreciates how serious this threat is.
The rising sea levels, the increased weather extremes, often these are very theoretical, abstract notions. They're not theoretical and abstract here. These are real, and where we are right now, this is the frontier. No textbook here. This is just reality.
And he says the consequences could reach far beyond Bangladesh.
A failed Bangladesh a Bangladesh that has not adapted to the impact of climate change, a Bangladesh that implodes, that's a tremendous security risk to the region and to us.
Southeast Asia is already a politically volatile region. To understand how climate change could create even more conflict, just look at a map. If the estimates are right, by the end of the century, tens of millions of Bangladeshis will be forced out of this area. If the country isn't able to provide another place for them, there's pretty much one place they can go. And India is already making it clear that it will go to great lengths to keep them out.
So every morning, you get an intelligence briefing. Your national security advisor, the CIA, comes over. Do you also get a regular briefing from your science advisor on these climate and environmental issues?
I do. At least once a day, you'll see something on the national security side or domestic policy side that is impacted in some fashion by the possibilities of climate change. The area where we are most concerned is how climate change could end up having profound national security implications in poorer countries. We're obviously concerned about drought in California or hurricanes and floods along our coastlines. All those things are bread and butter issues that touch on American families. But when you start seeing how these shifts can displace people, entire countries can be finding themselves unable to feed themselves, and the potential incidents of conflict that arises out of that, that gets your attention. There's a reason why the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff identified climate change as one of our most significant national security problems. It's not just the actual disasters that might arise. It is the accumulating stresses that are placed on a lot of different countries and the possibility of war, conflict, refugees, displacement that arise from changing climate.
You know, I did, for the Years of Living Dangerously series, I did the Syria drought and its impact on the revolution there. Right. And the most scary conclusion I drew from that is Syria couldn't manage a 4-year drought when they had a government.
Which gives you some sense of what happens in a lot of these countries that are just barely hanging on as it is. They don't have a lot of margin for error. That has national security implications. When people are hungry, when people are displaced, when there are a lot of young people, particularly young men, who are drifting without prospects for the future, the fertility of the soil for terrorism ends up being significant. It can have an impact on us.
We've reached base camp at an elevation of 10,000 feet. We'll spend the next few days here letting our bodies get used to the altitude before we push the rest of the way to the summit. Every day, Paul checks our oxygen levels. It reminds me just how extreme this journey is. But Paul seems to genuinely enjoy all of this. He's sort of like a real-life Indiana Jones.
You know, people think of climate science, people think of scientists as people who are like stuck in labs with lab coats and all that. And you guys do some of that, but you also do this. Mm-hmm. Keeping yourself alive while doing really good science is pretty tricky.
You have to learn how to live in these environments. And that's the big difference between the types of things that many of us who work in the field do and others. We know exactly where the data comes from. We can do 100 different measurements on a single little slab of ice. And from that, we can tell all sorts of things. Temperature, precipitation, storm patterns, where the storm came from, industrial pollutants, forest fires, volcanoes, on and on and on.
How far back in time can you go? With confidence? Year
by year, with quite reasonable confidence, we can go back 110,000 years.
Jesus.
Using an ice core that was about 10,000 feet thick that we drilled in Greenland. If you get an ice core from the correct place, you can solve problems. We were able to demonstrate that changes in acid rain increases were largely due to human activity. And the really exciting thing we were able to demonstrate is that as soon as the legislation came in, which the Clean Air Act, which reduced a lot of those emissions, you see the levels going down. So ice cores don't lie.
And there's something special about the ice at Tupungatito. Paul says this spot sits at the outer edge of one of the biggest and most important wind currents on the planet. The ice can tell us if that current is shifting, which could be the beginning of an abrupt climate change event. And it seems like something has been changing around here, at least according to our Chilean guides.
Salían harta agua y ahora un poquitito. A los caballos le llegaba hasta los cueros, la montura no se podía pasar. Y era harto pasto, vega, verde, ahora seca, puro polvo, nada. Y ya los pastizales ya no dan para tener muchos animales, pues ya no le dan para vivir.
All these changes have forced them to find other ways to make a living, like guiding us up this mountain. And tomorrow, we're going to need them more than ever as we make that final push to the summit. I'm feeling a little nervous. We're at 10,000 feet now. We're going up another 9,000 feet in a single day.
I'm with Morshed Ali Khan, the Bangladeshi journalist I met back in Dhaka. He wants to show me how dangerous the life of a climate migrant can be.
India is your biggest neighbor, and people find it easier to go into India than to Dhaka. And yes, there is a threat. Lots of people cross this border, Michael, and many of them illegally. Many men, women, children get shot dead by the border security force of India.
Wow. You can go this way?
That's India. You know,
So beyond this pole here is no man's land, they call it?
yes, I think so. We can always ask how far we can go. আরো কত দূর যেতে পারবো আমরা? ও দাদা, একজন শুনে, আমরা তো ফিল্ম বানাবো, আমরা আইন ভঙ্গ করতে চাই না। আমরা গেলাম এদিকে। We're allowed to go.
Morshed tells me this is considered one of the most dangerous borders in the world. I'm not sure how far I want to go.
Many of these houses are used as, you know, fast stopover for the aspiring migrant. So they spend the night here. In the middle of the night, they're just smuggled across.
Already, millions of Bangladeshis have fled across the border to India and are living and working there illegally, leading India to get very serious about stopping any more from crossing.
Let's walk a little faster, Michael, can we?
Sure.
Yeah, up to the fence, and then we get back. It's not a very safe place, you know?
Morshed says the Indian security forces have killed nearly 1,000 Bangladeshis.
Our threat is from the Indian side of the border. If they find that somebody is trying to intrude, they'll shoot and then talk, if he's alive.
Until a couple of years ago, they maintained a shoot-on-sight policy for anyone trying to cross without permission.
So just across there, you can see the fence, have a better look, view of the fence, just there.
Yeah, that's a long walk.
Yes.
Very exposed. Do you think any members of the Indian border police can see us from here?
Yeah.
Hello.
Dum, dum, dum.
Good one. All right, let's get out of here.
Yeah.
I've never been to such an eerie place, and I wonder what will happen here when millions of Bangladeshi homes are underwater.
And I don't know if that fence would deter people from trying to go across, you know. I don't think so. They're desperate. They're desperate.
Yeah.
years to go, if there's one thing you could do to advance this issue, what would you like it to be?
You know, the way we've solved previous pollution problems, like acid rain, was we said, we're going to charge you if you're releasing this stuff into the atmosphere. We're going to let you figure it out, but we're going to tell you you can't just keep on dumping it out in the atmosphere and making everybody else pay for it. So if there was one thing that I would like to see, it'd be for us to be able to price the cost of carbon emissions. We've obviously seen resistance from the Republican side of the aisle on that, and in fairness, there are some Democrats who've been concerned about it as well, because regionally, they're very reliant on heavy industry and old power plants, and they're worried about significant change on that front.
When you're dealing with a lot of those people in the House Republican caucus, climate skeptic at best, denier at worst, every once in a while, you just want to go off on them. I mean, go off like a Roman candle. I was like, what is it with you people? You know, I mean, you know, your kid is sick, you consult 100 doctors, 97 of them tell you to do this, 3 tell you to do that, and you want to go with the 3. That's not conservative. I mean, do you every once in a while just want to...
Yeah. Absolutely.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Look, it's frustrating when the science is in front of us. And we can argue about how. But let's not argue about what's going on. The science is compelling. The baseline fact of climate change is not something that we can afford to deny. And if you profess leadership in this country at this moment in our history, then you've got to recognize that this is going to be one of the most significant long-term challenges, if not the most significant long-term challenge that this country faces and the planet faces. The good news is that the public may get out ahead of some of these politicians. And I think that as the public starts seeing greater frequency of extreme weather events, as they start seeing that what used to be 100-year storms seem to be happening every year or 2, and you start seeing the economics of inaction, then people start thinking, you know what, we're going to reward politicians who talk to us honestly and seriously about this problem.
The final ascent is sheer madness. We creep along a narrow ridge with steep 1,000-foot drops on either side. A single false step here, and someone could actually die.
You remember that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he's running out of the cave and the big ball is rolling behind him? I felt that much peril coming up here.
This is why people study coral reefs.
This is why people study coral reefs. Good point.
After 5 grueling days, this trek has taken its toll. 2 members of our team were injured. 2 more became so sick they couldn't continue. But we finally made it. Just barely. At this altitude, there's so little oxygen that I'm finding it hard to think straight.
Oh my God.
But for Paul, this is when the real work begins.
Okay, Gino, you ready?
Ready?
Fire away.
Wow. That goes down like butter.
Okay, thanks, Gino. I'll hold on to it tight. They've got clean gloves on, so it's not contaminated.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All right, now what?
And then all over this glacier will be
bigger and bigger course. Bigger and bigger sections.
I'm going to transfer and process.
Can I get near you?
Yeah, sure. A little bit closer, yeah.
Okay.
We are going scrape just to have a clean section. Yeah.
Just shaving off that ice.
Yep.
Just
the outer area might be contaminated from the drill itself, so we try to remove the outer portion.
And I'm staying downwind of you at all times so that I don't get it contaminated. Is that it?
Yeah.
That's why you guys are dressed up
That's
like
why we dress up.
spacemen.
Just to give you an idea, if you touch that with your bare hand, there's enough sweat in your bare hand to make it look like a big ocean storm. Sea salt coming from the ocean. So we have to be very, very careful.
He's gonna pop it out. That's safe now? I can hold it?
It's safe, yeah.
I am holding a little bit of the past.
That's it. Got what we needed.
And when we get back to Paul's lab, we'll find out what that piece of ice has to say.
I'm heading to a district called Shakira, a few miles away from the Indian border, to see Shahidul, the climate migrant I met back in Dhaka. After 2 cyclones devastated his home, Shahidul moved to Dhaka and almost lost his life when the building where he worked collapsed.
Hello, Shahidul. Thank you. Thank you for meeting us here.
Hi.
He says he's very happy to see you. And his house is 5 kilometers away from here.
Okay.
So he's inviting you to go with him to his house. Tahatro? This way? Okay.
Sit down.
Oh, it's nice.
টানাপোড়া ধসে পড়ার পরে আমার বাড়ির পরিবেশে আসতে পারবে আমি এরকম চিন্তা ছিল না আর
After the disaster, you never thought that I would be able to come back home.
Can I ask, how did you feel when you heard that Shahidul was heading to Dhaka to work?
আমার আব্বু যাই মন দি চাই নিয়ে বন্ধন কি নুনি তোমার যাইতে হবে না
She says they didn't want him to go anywhere. But Shahidul's father didn't earn enough to run the family, so he had to help.
আমাদের তো ঘরবাড়ি তো হয়ে গেল এগুলি আমরা ওই
He says that Ayla devastated his house.
Where was your house before Ayla?
এইটাই উপরে
Just here.
Would you be willing to show us the site where the house once stood?
যাবেন? আচ্ছা চলেন যে বাসাটা একটু দেখেন Let's go. চলো। This is where his old house was. Ayla destroyed it, and then he shifted across the road.
Yeah, you only moved right across the road. You didn't go any further. Why?
দূরে তো জায়গা নেই
He doesn't have any land elsewhere. So this is the land he found suitable.
I imagine the experience of Ayla was very scary. What was it like? What do you remember?
যখন পানি বৃদ্ধ হয় সেই সময় আমাদের বাচ্চা কাচ্চাগুলো নিয়ে যে কোথায় যাই
Everything was swept away by the high tide. You know, I preferred to save my children rather than my belongings.
Of course. Do you fear or even expect that a storm like Ayla will come again?
আপনি কি মনে করেন যে ওই আইলার মতো জলোচ্ছ্বাস আবার হবে?
আল্লাহ জানে আমি তো
Allah knows.
Right.
Says.
We put a lot on you. You're the president, obviously.
As Michelle reminded me, I volunteered for the job. Yeah.
But it does seem to me that you could use your bully pulpit, if nothing else, to really shift public opinion on this issue. So for the next president.
Right.
Because in some ways, Mr. President, it feels like we're waiting for the perfect storm. Storm big enough to end the debate, but not so big as to end the world. And that's really what I worry about. Do you see that potentially?
I would say this. The way to shift public opinion is not simply a top-down strategy. It's got to be a bottom-up strategy so that people can see what kind of impact is climate change potentially having on my community. Is it going to affect my property values because suddenly I'm in a flood zone where I wasn't 10 years ago? Is it going to have an impact in terms of my farm because I noticed that the water that I rely on is less regular? The point is that people live in the here and the now, and the more we can make the climate issue something that is here and now, that's how public opinion is going to shift.
We interviewed Secretary Kerry, and one of the points he made is that we would really benefit if there were a mass movement.
The good news is the next generation, I think, is much more mindful of this. They worry about it. They care about it. The thing that we have to fight is the cynicism that they may feel about government being able to do anything about it.
That may be the greatest threat to dealing with this problem.
And one of the things that I constantly tell my team, because look, when you're working in Washington, sometimes you feel like you're rolling a boulder up a hill, and nowhere do you feel that more than on something like climate change. The most important thing is to guard against cynicism. I want to make sure that everybody who's been watching this program or listening to this interview doesn't start concluding that, well, we're all doomed, there's nothing we can do about it. There's a lot we can do about it. It's not going to happen as fast or as smoothly or as elegantly as we'd like. But if we are persistent, we will make progress. That's been the history of this country, and generally the trajectory of the world has been when push comes to shove, we respond.
I'm on my way to Paul Majewski's lab at the University of Maine. Last time we saw each other, we had just come down from the summit of Tupungatito. Now I want to know what he's finding in those samples we took.
Hey, how are you?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Paul.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. You look great.
So do you.
You look like you.
But it turns out my time in the freezing cold isn't over.
All set?
Yep.
There we go. Minus 20 after you.
Right.
So this is a piece of the ice that we brought back from Tupungatito, if you remember.
Wow.
Yep.
That looks exactly like that ice. I'm just kidding. I have no idea. I mean, it looks all. That's from Tupungatito.
Yep. Yep, it is. Now you're going to see something really amazing. You're going to see the highest resolution results that have ever come from an ice core. So here we are at the laser system.
Right.
Our piece of ice from Tupungatito is now sitting inside this cold cell. In the first day we used this instrument, we collected more data points than I collected in the 40 years that I've been looking at ice cores and sampling ice cores in one day. It's mind-blowing because
In one day more than what you'd done in 40 years.
Yes. That thing that looks like a worm is the laser. That's the edge of an ice crystal. You see those things? It's cutting its way through. In there, we can tell levels of calcium, sodium, potassium, sulfur in the atmosphere.
It's basically a chemistry lab in a box.
Yes, yes. And each one of those has a climate story to tell.
Wow. Is there anything surprising that you learned from the Tupungatito sample that we brought back?
Yes.
And what's the shocker?
It looks as if it's a lot dustier up near the top, and that probably means that it's getting drier. So the next question is, why is it getting drier?
Paul tells me the answer lies with a surprising culprit: the wind.
big thing about the wind is that the wind is what transports moisture. You know where the winds go, you know where the moisture goes.
I had no idea the wind was so important. Paul tells me giant wind patterns are actually one of the biggest things driving our climate. They're like atmospheric superhighways that move water vapor around the planet, determining which places get rain and which don't.
So what changes where the winds go? That has a lot to do with the fact that the polar latitudes are cold, and as you get closer to the equator, obviously it gets warmer. But those temperature differences can change, and they change because of greenhouse gas warming and because of ozone depletion over Antarctica. So the net result is that greenhouse gas warming, things that we're doing in the atmosphere, are actually beginning to move where the winds are and the strength of the winds. And we wanted to go to Tupungatito, which is right there, because you can see it's at the very northern limit of the westerly wind. So it makes it a very sensitive place for seeing whether the wind can, how far north the wind can get. These winds, the westerly winds, are moving closer and closer to Antarctica than they have been probably in thousands of years. And they're actually also speeding up around Antarctica.
As the winds move south, places just to the north will get less rain. And it goes far beyond Tupungatito. Paul says places all across the planet's southern latitudes are likely to dry out just because of this one shift. Even more frightening, this shift could be a warning sign for a more abrupt change in wind patterns still to come.
We discovered that the climate can literally go from one state to another, many degrees Fahrenheit shift in less than a year or two, and stay there for decades to hundreds of years. Today, we're pushing the system to higher concentrations than anything in the last million years, and probably
doing fast.
And many times faster than we've ever done it before.
Paul reminds me that in the past, changes like this have brought down civilizations. What could this mean for us?
At the end of my trip, I share a meal with Shahidul. Soon, we're both going back to Dhaka. But really, we're heading in opposite directions. I'm on my way home, and he's leaving his. He was only able to visit his family for a few days. It's hard not to think about how different our lives are. It feels like we're in totally different worlds. But I've seen how connected those worlds actually are. Because what my country puts into the air is affecting more and more people like him. It reminds me of something Atiq said.
These are young people, many of them are restless, and they're being displaced, and many of them now understand the causal relationship, that it is somebody else's greenhouse gas that's causing my displacement. Shahidul represents that whole phenomenon. This is an issue of environmental justice and global human rights. Why are these people being displaced? Who has caused their displacement? Who is going to pay for it? And where are they going to go? If 70% of Bangladesh land is going underwater for 1 meter sea level rise, if another country came and invaded for that piece of land, every Bangladeshi will give their life and fight. Now here, who do we fight? Somebody has to take the blame.
And somebody has to lead the way toward a solution. Because eventually, climate change will touch us all.
Whoa! We are ready, aren't we? How about this one?
I have been searching all of my days, all of my days. Many a road, you know, I've been walking on. all of my days, and I've been trying to find what's been in my mind as the days keep turning into night.
A sprinkle of rain falls on the soil, and from that soil comes life.
Well, I have been quietly standing in the shade all of my days. Watch the sky breaking on the promise that we made. All of this rain, and I've been trying to find what's been in my mind.
I love you. I'll see you this afternoon, okay?
As the days keep turning into night. So I smile, I know I'll feel this loneliness no more. All of my days. For I look around me, and it seems you found me, and it's coming into sight as the days keep turning into night. As the days keep turning into night.